In 2014, the city of Flint, 106 kilometers, 66 miles northwest of Detroit, was in a dire situation. In fact, if we're being accurate, Flint's been battling a tsunami of recession, poor management, and bad luck since the late 1970s. Moving into the second decade of the 21st century, the city had a population of 8,000, down from 80,000 just 30 years before, the painful result of downsizing in the automobile sector. Flint had become synonymous with crises, high crime rates, low employment, two periods under state financial emergency from 2002 to 2004, and again from 2011 to 2015. This city has not been doing well. And yet, that was all just the tip of the iceberg. One fateful decision in 2014, no doubt with honourable intentions but catastrophic results, made Flint synonymous with something altogether darker and much harder to see: dirty water. The decision to switch Flint's water supply from Detroit Water and Sewage Department, which sources its water from Lake Huron and the Detroit River, to Flint River nearby, was devastating. Within weeks, residents began complaining about the smell, taste, and appearance of the water, and it was soon found that aging pipes were leaking lead into the city's water supply. In June 2014, just 2 months after the switch, an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease swept through Flint, though this wasn't made officially public for another 2 years. The crisis left a dark stain on the region that remains to this very day. It's thought that at least 12 people died as a result, but it might be many decades before we know the full extent of the thousands of children who were exposed to toxic drinking water for years. Flint made headlines worldwide because of its dirty water. But if you step back and look at the United States as a whole, it's sometimes not a pretty sight. It may be the world's wealthiest nation, but clean drinking water is not always a given. Now, if we zoom out from the sagging fortunes of this small city in Michigan, we find a mixed situation around the United States. During the 33 years between 1982 and 2015, there were an astonishing 17,900 water quality violations for community water systems across the US, meaning that on average, in any given year, between 9 million and 45 million Americans were drinking water from sources that directly violated the Safe Drinking Water Act signed in 1974. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that this usually didn't concern Beverly Hills or the Upper West Side of Manhattan. These violations typically occurred in rural, low-income areas, often close to factories and manufacturing zones. But surely things were improving. Well, no, not as much as you might think. In 2015, just as the residents of Flint began to understand they'd been drinking water laced with lead for the best part of a year, it's thought that 21 million people around the United States, that's around 6% of the entire population, were consuming unclean water regularly. In 2014, the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, estimated that 17 different pathogens had led to 7.15 million illnesses, 601,000 emergency department visits, 118,000 hospitalizations, and a shocking 6,630 deaths. Now let's caveat those figures by saying that between 3,000 to 5,000 children daily die from dirty water worldwide. In comparison, the United States is doing rather well. But tell that to the parents of children drinking contaminated water caused by factories leaking chemicals into rivers or pipes that should have been replaced years ago. In the first world, we become entirely accustomed to turning on the tap and slurping happily from it. But with new boil water advisories appearing every year across the United States, guzzling freely from the tap seems to be a big no-no. Now, when we look at causes of water crises around the United States, we often see historical issues that stemmed from outright criminality by certain businesses that led to rivers and water sources being contaminated by chemicals and manufacturing byproducts. While a newer problem, and by new, I mean now we're only thinking about and checking on it, is that drinking water is being funneled into communities through old pipes that should have been replaced years ago. This means the water runs through an appalling concoction of chemicals and toxic waste before reaching American taps. Several high-profile court cases and more stringent government guidelines have meant that businesses polluting water systems are becoming rarer. However, you don't need to go back that far to find a shocking number. Starting in the 1950s, a DuPont chemical plant in Parkersburg, West Virginia, began discharging a chemical called perfluorocatenoic acid, PFOA, also known as C8, into the local water supply. C8 was used for various purposes, but was a principal component of Teflon, the magic substance sprayed on frying pans to create a non-stick, waterproof, non-corrosive, and non-reactive surface. The problem was that from 1982, DuPont knew full well that C8 was toxic for humans, and it continued releasing it into the rivers around the town. Water tests done in 1984 revealed toxicity levels 8 times higher than normal. Even when a larger than normal number of DuPont employees started coming down with cancer, the company still said nothing. It wasn't until 2001 that a lawsuit was filed on behalf of the residents of Parkersburg, events dramatized in the film Dark Waters. In 2017, DuPont agreed to pay $671 million to settle the case, but in a sick, twisted, ironic sort of way, DuPont's share price actually went up that day because the figure was below what had been expected and increased again a month later. This was just a drop in the ocean for a company with an annual revenue of just over $13 billion in 2022. There was a remarkably similar story across the country in Hinckley, California. This tale was also made into a film that champions the work of local lawyer Erin Brockovich. She fought for years to reveal that Pacific Gas and Electric had dumped 1,400 million liters, that's 370 million gallons, of hexavalent chromium, or chromium-6, into an unlined pond near their compressor station in the 1950s and 60s. This led to the chemicals seeping into the town's water supply, but for decades the residents of Hinckley suffered in oblivion. Numerous residents became sick or reportedly died of cancers relating to the contamination, and a long-running lawsuit was finally settled in 1996 for $333 million, which is around $621 million in 2023. We should point out that 40% of that figure went to lawyers, while the rest was haphazardly shared among the town's residents, but only those who participated in the class action. There remains a deep bitterness towards Pacific Gas and Electric and the lawyers involved in Hinckley to this day. Nearly 20 years later, the town's population has plummeted, with many abandoned buildings bought up by Pacific Gas and Electric and then bulldozed. It's always as if they're trying to erase any memory of what happened in Hinckley. And sadly, there have been numerous cases like this over the last 50 years or so. The American drive for rapid industrialization after World War II led to corners being cut across the country, and infuriatingly, these companies almost always get away with it. Calculating the Pacific Gas and Electric settlement in 2022 equates to less than 3% of its annual revenue. The reality of dirty water in the United States caused by criminal negligence is that companies have the power, money, and time to fight the cases as far as they go and then pay a paltry sum compared to what they make while not a single person is held criminally responsible. Now, while there have been some appalling cases of companies nonchalantly discharging toxic chemicals into drinking water, that's not actually the primary cause of the problem in 2023, or as far as we can tell it's not. One enormous issue facing the United States, conveniently pushed aside for more salacious and argumentative topics, is the disgraceful state of much of the country's infrastructure. Now, we'll be coming to water pipes shortly, but to put this problem into a bit of a larger perspective, let's begin with bridges, shall we? The American Society of Civil Engineers report card recently rated the nation's infrastructure as a C-. That's up from a D- in 2017 and represents its highest ranking in 20 years thanks to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act signed in 2021, which set aside $550 billion for upgrades across various sectors. Now, this really is excellent news, and it couldn't have come fast enough. What with 46,000 of the nation's bridges in such bad shape that it would take another 50 years just to complete all of the currently needed repairs. A report out of Utah State University in 2014 placed the number of collapsed bridges each year at between 88 and 222, averaging 128 per year over the last few decades. Now, if we return to water, the US system loses enough water daily to fill 9,000 swimming pools despite 19,312 kilometers or 12,000 miles of water pipes being replaced yearly. New York City alone loses 378 million liters, 100 million gallons daily because of its antiquated water pipes and the enormous repair cost. It's clear that the United States is struggling badly to keep up in many areas. Even the scary spectre of China spending 4 or 5 times the amount on its infrastructure, or European nations investing far more in terms of overall GDP, doesn't seem to be doing that much. The issue strikes at the core of what we're coming to next. There's no doubt that the money is available in the United States, but the will to invest it on its people, particularly the very worst off, has been declining since the 1970s. You see, while big cities and affluent areas can usually upgrade piping and install the latest water treatment technology, smaller rural areas are often left behind. Smaller water systems usually rack up around twice the number of health violations that larger providers do, which could be because of various reasons. Around the world, you'll find communities struggling financially, and the US is no different. Sometimes it's down to poor management or simply poor circumstances with nobody to blame, but often this leads to heavy cutbacks. Suddenly, that much-needed upgrade to some aging water pipes gets pushed to the back of the line, or that more generous proposal for an alternate water supply begins to seem all the more appealing. It's important to stress that this is very rarely down to malicious intent. When you can upgrade your water pipes, rebuild a school section, or purchase essential hospital equipment, the choice is not exactly straightforward. However, as seen with Flint, these choices sometimes have terrible consequences. And there's the problem of adequately staffing water treatment sites in remote areas. Many of these require a staff member on the premises at all times, often a monotonous and poorly paid position that is difficult to fill and virtually impossible to maintain in the long run. Flint may be the best known example of a city with dirty water, but it's far from the only one. In Keystone, West Virginia, the water can simply vanish for days on end, while in Brady, Texas, levels of radium are 9 times higher than the EPA limit. Over in California, in the city of Dos Palos, residents now drink bottled water after trihalomethanes, a group of chemicals linked to kidney problems and increased cancer risk, were found in their water supply. Remember I said that cities are usually better? Well, that's not always the case. In 2017, the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority warned residents to boil all of their water before consumption. In Newark, between 2017 and 2019, testing revealed lead levels that exceeded 15 parts per billion, well above what the EPA says is acceptable. Michigan, Baltimore, Pensacola, Las Vegas, Reno, Houston. These are just some of the major cities that have struggled with dirty water in recent decades. Pensacola is widely considered the worst offenders, scoring a positive from half of the nearly 101 chemicals tested for. This included radium-228, cyanide, chloroform, trichloroethylene, tetrachloroethylene, alpha particles, benzene, and lead. However, to tie this all together with a nicely knotted metaphorical bow, we must end in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C. Now, if you think the city is all gleaming bridges and parks and the White House and the Mall, you're painfully mistaken. Washington, D.C. is a city of two halves. The haves, those often working in politics, and the have-nots, which is everybody else. High unemployment, high crime rates, and pitiful education standards have become the norm for the poorest residents in Washington, D.C. And then we come to the water. In the early 2000s, an elevated level of lead was found in the city's water system, leading to substantial changes in which much of the lead piping around the capital was replaced. And yet, as is usually the case, poorer neighborhoods, which also happen to be predominantly African-American neighborhoods, came last, and there are thought to be thousands of homes across the city still using lead pipes. Now, if you want the most up-to-date crisis, look no further than Jackson, Mississippi, a city with a population of 150,000 that has had a badly interrupted water supply for well over a decade. When a winter storm damaged some of the water lines in 2010, few in Jackson would have expected that 13 years later their water supply would still not be any better. But it'd actually get much worse. A series of initiatives to raise money to fix the problem ran into problems, and in 2016, there was a sizable water leak that is still not fixed as you're watching this video. Yes, indeed, in the richest nation in the world, a water leak that happened 7 years ago still is not fixed, and the population is routinely asked to boil their water before consuming it. And to make things even worse, in August 2022, when the nearby Pearl River flooded, it caused the O.B. Curtis water treatment plant to cease operations altogether. The water did eventually come back on, then it went off, and so goes the lives of the residents of Jackson, Mississippi. It's a painful example of how bad things can get. Now, before we bring today's video to a close, we should say that the vast majority of water in the United States is certified as acceptable to drink. That's around 95%. However, there is a slight problem with this kind of feel-good fact. Acceptable is only the level that the government has set. Regarding lead, the US government says that 2.2 micrograms per day for children and 8.8 for females of childbearing age is okay. Still, many independent environmental agencies believe this is too high, while even the World Health Organization has stated that there is no known safe blood lead concentration. While things have certainly tightened up since the cowboy days post-World War II, the United States still allows the use of certain chemicals banned in other parts of the world, such as formaldehyde, titanium dioxide, and cyclotetrasiloxane, as well as potassium bromate. Many of these chemicals concern other countries enough that they ban them outright. But for whatever reason, and let's take a wild guess here and say corporate lobbying, they remain legal and widely used in the US. We've got very little idea what effects these types of chemicals have on the human body over several decades, just as we didn't know how damaging C8 was back in the 1950s. And because of that, water in the United States is likely much more polluted than people are led to believe. However, we have plenty of research on lead poisoning in children, and it's grim reading. Those with lead poisoning tend to have lower IQs, high rates of attention deficit disorder, poor memory, and a lack of impulse control. But that's just the start. During their adult years, they have a higher risk for kidney disease, stroke, and hypertension, while some studies have linked lead exposure to incarceration for violent crime. There's a growing water problem in the United States, a combination of business negligence that goes blatantly unpunished and an aging system, as well as a general apathy towards poorer sections of society and, at times, appalling mismanagement and even corruption, meaning that one of the most vital substances needed to keep humans alive and fit and healthy is not regularly available. You can argue over the exact reasons and ways to address it, But this is an issue of such an enormous scale that many politicians choose to turn a blind eye. The costs associated and legislative changes to go after the worst offenders are not popular measures among the US Senate and Congress, even though they concern something as primal to all of us as assuring that children have access to clean water. Flint wasn't the start, and it won't be the end. There's a whole lot of dirty water in the wealthiest country in the world.